Alright everyone, settle in for tonight's exploration. We're veering off the well-trodden path of heroic sagas and stepping into something a touch more unvarnished. Prepare for a deep dive, not into celebrated triumphs, but into the forgotten toil and the everyday grit of life in the gilded cage of 17th century Versailles, France. That glossy version of history you've seen in movies, all powdered wigs and graceful minuet. Well, the unvarnished truth was often a far cry, and frankly your modern comforts would feel like a distant, unimaginable dream. So, find your coziest spot. If you appreciate a journey into the raw, unfiltered past, a like on the video would be fantastic, and do consider subscribing for more of these historical reality checks. As always, I'm curious to know where you're joining us from tonight. Drop a comment with your location and time. It's always a highlight seeing our global community. Okay, perhaps dim those lights, let a soft ambient sound fill the room, and let's embark on tonight's rather sobering journey together. You picture Versailles, and immediately images of unparalleled splendor flood your mind. Golden gates, sprawling gardens, halls lined with mirrors reflecting an endless dance of light and aristocracy. It was the epicenter of European power and culture, the Sun King, Louis XIV, radiating his brilliance upon a seemingly adoring court. But tonight, we're not here to admire the facade. We're here to peel back the gold leaf, to brush away the perfumed powder, and to expose the grime, the anxiety, and the sheer, unglamorous effort it took to simply exist, let alone thrive, within those hallowed yet often squalid walls, during its formative, and arguably harshest, early decades under Louis. The very air you'd breathe at Versailles, particularly in the bustling, less-than-private corridors, was a far cry from the fragrant gardens outside. Imagine thousands of people, nobles, servants, petitioners, guards, crammed into a space not initially designed for such a permanent, massive population. Personal hygiene, as you understand it, was a concept still in its infancy. Baths were infrequent, a luxury or even a medical treatment rather than a daily ritual. Perfume wasn't just an adornment, it was a desperate attempt to mask the pervasive odors of unwashed bodies, stale food, and something far, far worse emanating from poorly maintained latrines, or the lack thereof in many areas. Think about the sanitation, or rather the conspicuous lack of it. While the king might have had his private, relatively clean commode, for many of the courtiers, relief was often found in less than ideal locations. Chamber pots were ubiquitous, of course, their contents frequently and unceremoniously emptied out of windows into courtyards or designated slop areas. But in a crowded palace, even these were not always accessible. It wasn't uncommon for hallways, stairwells, and even fireplaces to become makeshift toilets, especially during grand events when the palace was packed to the rafters. The smell, you can only imagine, would have been an ever-present assault on the sense. The sheer number of animals living within or near the palace grounds contributed to this olfactory nightmare. Dogs were popular companions for the nobility, and they weren't always house-trained to modern standards. Horses, essential for transport and a symbol of status, were stabled nearby, their manure adding another layer to the rich tapestry of smells. Then there were the kitchens, constantly roasting meats and preparing elaborate dishes, the smoke and food odors mingling with everything else. You'd be navigating a world where your nose was constantly processing a barrage of information, most of it unpleasant, a stark contrast to your sanitized modern environment. Let's talk about your personal space, or the distinct lack of it. While the grand apartments of the highest nobility might seem spacious, many courtiers were crammed into tiny, often unheated attic rooms or mezzanines. These were not the luxurious suites of your imagination. Picture a small, dark and drafty space, perhaps shared with minimal furniture and even less privacy. The walls were thin, and every cough, every argument, every clandestine whisper from your neighbors could potentially be overheard. This lack of personal sanctuary would have been a constant source of stress and discomfort, a far cry from the serene solitude you might seek for a good night's sleep. The pressure to be seen, to be present at court at all times, was immense. Louis XIV orchestrated court life as a continuous performance, and your attendance was not optional if you wished to remain in favor. This meant endless hours spent standing, waiting, and navigating crowded antechambers, all in the hope of catching the king's eye, or securing a brief word with an influential figure. Imagine the physical exhaustion, the aching feet, the stiff backs, all while trying to maintain an air of effortless elegance. The gilded cage was also a demanding stage, and the performance never truly ended, leaving little room for genuine rest or private life. And the clothing. Oh, the magnificent, restrictive clothing. For the ladies it meant corsets tightened to achieve the fashionable narrow waist, constricting breath and internal organs. Heavy silk and brocade gowns, adorned with intricate embroidery and jewels, weighed you down. For the men, elaborate coats, breeches and stockings, often made from wool or velvet, would have been incredibly hot and stuffy, especially in crowded, unventilated rooms. Moving gracefully was an art form but also a physical challenge. Simply sitting, or navigating a narrow doorway in these elaborate constructions, required practice and patience, adding another layer of physical burden to your daily existence. The cost of maintaining this appearance was ruinous for many. You were expected to possess an extensive wardrobe, with different outfits for various occasions, each more splendid than the last. New fashions emerged constantly, and failing to keep up was a sign of declining fortune or worse, royal disfavor. Many nobles bankrupted themselves and their families, taking on enormous debts simply to afford the silks, laces and wigs demanded by courtly life. This constant financial anxiety, the fear of falling from grace due to an outmoded coat, would have been a gnawing undercurrent to the glittering surface of Versailles. Food, while often lavishly presented at the king's table, and for high-ranking nobles, was not always a guarantee of good nutrition or even safety for everyone else. For those lower down the courtly pecking order, or for the vast army of servants, meals could be meager, repetitive, and of questionable quality. Even for the privileged, food preservation was a challenge. Meat might be heavily salted or spiced, to disguise a less than fresh taste. Fresh fruits and vegetables, especially out of season, were rare delicacies. You might be dining on elaborate constructions of sugar and pastry, impressive to behold, but not necessarily a balanced or healthy diet. The preparation of these grand feasts was a monumental undertaking, happening in vast, hot and often chaotic kitchens. Armies of cooks, scullions and servants toiled in conditions that would horrify a modern health inspector. Smoke, steam, and the smell of roasting meat filled the air. Vermin were a constant battle. The risk of food poisoning, from improperly stored ingredients or cross-contamination, was a very real threat. A grand banquet could easily turn into a night of agonizing stomach cramps, and worse, a far cry from the refined image projected in the dining hall. You'd always be taking a slight gamble with every bite. Water, the very essence of life, was a precious and often problematic commodity at Versailles. While the famous fountains were a marvel of engineering, the water that supplied them and that was available for drinking and washing was not always pure. It was often drawn from rivers or ponds that could be contaminated. Even if you were wealthy enough to afford wine as your primary beverage, which many did, water for washing or cooking remained a concern. The concept of boiling water for safety wasn't widely understood or practiced, making waterborne illnesses a constant lurking danger. Illness in general was a frequent and unwelcome visitor at Versailles. Without an understanding of germ theory, diseases spread rapidly through the crowded palace. Smallpox, influenza, dysentery, typhoid fever, these were common and often fatal. Medical treatments were rudimentary, sometimes barbaric by modern standards. Bloodletting, purging, and questionable herbal concoctions were the mainstays of medical practice. A simple infection, something you'd treat with antibiotics today, could easily become a death sentence. The fear of falling ill, and the often painful ineffectiveness of available remedies, would have been a constant shadow. The cold was another relentless enemy, especially during the harsh European winter. While the king's apartments might have large fireplaces, many other parts of the palace, particularly the smaller rooms and corridors, were drafty and poorly heated. You'd spend months wrapped in furs and heavy woolens, even indoors, constantly battling a pervasive chill that seeped into your bones. Imagine trying to write a letter, with fingers numb from cold, or waking up in a frigid room with ice on the inside of your window panes. This constant exposure to cold would have lowered resistance to illness and made daily life a struggle for warmth. And then there was the noise. Versailles was not a tranquil retreat. The constant coming and going of people, the clatter of carriages on cobblestones, the distant sounds of construction, as the palace was perpetually being expanded, the chatter in a dozen languages, the music for balls and ceremonies, it all combined into a cacophony that rarely ceased. For those seeking peace and quiet, it was an elusive commodity. Sleep itself might be interrupted by late-night revelries, or the early morning bustle of servants. Your ears would rarely find true silence. The social pressures were, perhaps, the most insidious torment. Every word, every gesture, every alliance was scrutinized. Gossip and rumor were rampant, capable of destroying reputations and careers in an instant. You were constantly navigating a treacherous landscape of shifting allegiances, hidden enmities, and favor carrying. A misstep, a poorly chosen phrase, or an association with the wrong faction could lead to banishment from court, the ultimate disgrace and financial ruin. This relentless psychological warfare, the need to always be on guard, would have been emotionally exhausting. Privacy, as you know it, was virtually non-existent for anyone of note. Louis XIV believed in keeping his nobles close, under his watchful eye. Your movements, your conversations, even your correspondence, might be monitored. Servants, often desperate for advancement or a small reward, could be informants. This created an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust. You could never be entirely sure who was a friend, and who was merely feigning friendship while reporting your every indiscretion back to a higher authority. It was a life lived under a microscope. The strict etiquette, the intricate dance of bows, curtsies and precedents, governed every interaction. Knowing who to bow to, how deeply, and in what order was a complex skill in itself. A mistake in etiquette could be interpreted as an insult or a sign of ignorance, leading to social ostracization or ridicule. This constant need to perform, to remember and execute hundreds of arcane rules of behavior, added another layer of mental strain to the already demanding court life. It was a system designed to reinforce hierarchy and keep everyone in their place, but it was also profoundly wearisome. For women at court, life presented its own unique set of challenges. While some wielded considerable influence, as mistresses or through powerful family connections, many were essentially pawns in dynastic games, their marriages arranged for political or financial advantage. They were expected to be beautiful, accomplished and above all discreet. The pressure to produce heirs was immense, and childbirth was a perilous affair. Beyond the glittering balls and fashionable attire, their lives were often tightly circumscribed by societal expectations and the ambitions of their male relatives. Childhood at Versailles for the offspring of the nobility was not the carefree existence you might imagine. Children were often seen as miniature adults, dressed in restrictive clothing and subjected to the same rigorous etiquette from a young age. Education focused on preparing them for their future roles in courtly society. Emotional warmth and parental bonding in the modern sense were often secondary to the demands of status and protocol. Mortality rates for children were tragically high, and the loss of a child, while deeply felt, was a grimly common occurrence. The pursuit of pleasure, while a visible aspect of court life, often had a desperate edge. Gambling was rampant, with fortunes won and lost in a single night. Love affairs and intrigues provided drama and distraction, but also carried significant risks of scandal and disgrace. The endless succession of balls, hunts and theatrical performances could be seen as an attempt to mask the underlying anxieties and the sheer tedium that could set in amidst the gilded routine. These diversions were less about genuine joy and more about staving off boredom and the ever-present awareness of one's precarious position. Think of the intellectual climate. While Versailles was a center for arts and patronage, genuine freedom of thought or expression, especially if it veered towards criticism of the king or the established order, was severely limited. Writers, philosophers, and artists depended on royal or noble patronage, which often came with implicit or explicit expectations of conformity. To challenge the status quo was to risk losing everything. This created an environment where flattery often outweighed honest critique, and intellectual discourse could be constrained by the need to please those in power. The sheer tedium of waiting was a significant part of life at Versailles. Waiting for an audience with the king, waiting for a meal to be served, waiting for a carriage, waiting for a patron to notice you. Hours, days, even weeks, could be spent in a state of anxious anticipation. This unproductive time, filled with little more than an effort to be seen in the right places, would have been incredibly frustrating for anyone with an active mind or a desire for purposeful activity. It was a system that often valued presence over productivity, appearance over substance. And what about the servants? The unseen army that kept the glittering machine of Versailles running. Their lives were ones of relentless toil, long hours, and meager pay. They lived in cramped, often squalid quarters, far from the splendor they helped maintain. They were subject to the whims and often the abuses of their noble masters. Their health, their well-being, their very existence, was largely ignored by the official chronicles of courtly life. Yet without their labor, the entire edifice would have crumbled. Theirs was a truly unglamorous reality.
Consider the journey to and from Versailles. Roads in the 17th century were not the smooth asphalt ribbons you're accustomed to. They were often rutted, muddy, and dangerous. A carriage journey, even for a short distance, could be a bone-jarring, uncomfortable, and lengthy ordeal. Breakdowns were common, and the threat of highwaymen, while perhaps romanticized now, was a genuine concern. Arriving at the palace, or departing from it, was not a simple matter of hailing a cab or hopping on a train. It required planning, resources, and a tolerance for significant discomfort. The concept of leisure as you understand it, a time for personal hobbies, relaxation, or simply doing nothing, was alien to the highly structured and performative nature of court life. Even activities that might seem leisurely, like hunting or attending a play, were imbued with social and political significance. Every moment was an opportunity to advance your position or risk falling behind. There was little room for genuine, unobserved personal time. The pressure to be on was constant and unyielding, a relentless demand on your energy and attention. The dental hygiene of the era, or rather the lack of it, would be shocking to you. Sugar, once a rare luxury, was becoming more common among the wealthy, leading to widespread tooth decay. Toothbrushes, as you know them, did not exist. People might use twigs or cloth to rub their teeth, or various abrasive powders, but effective prevention of decay and gum disease was impossible. Toothaches, abscesses, and eventual tooth loss were common afflictions, contributing to pain, difficulty eating, and the famously less than pearly smiles often hidden behind fans or polite hands. The sheer spectacle of royal events, such as a state reception or a royal wedding, involved an incredible amount of preparation and often discomfort for the participant. Imagine standing for hours in a heavy, elaborate costume, in a room packed with hundreds of other similarly attired individuals, all vying for a glimpse of the royal family, or a moment of recognition. The heat, the crush of bodies, the strain of maintaining composure. It was a far cry from a relaxed social gathering. These events were exercises in endurance as much as displays of magnificence. Personal security, even within the palace walls, was not always guaranteed. While the king was heavily guarded, lesser nobles or those who had made enemies could be vulnerable. Duels, though officially forbidden, still occurred, often with fatal consequences. To settle matters of honor or personal slights, intrigues could turn violent. The labyrinthine corridors and less policed areas of the vast palace could provide cover for clandestine meetings or even assaults. You couldn't always assume you were safe, even in the heart of the kingdom. The world outside the palace walls, for many courtiers, was a distant and almost alien concept. Their entire existence revolved around the microcosm of Versailles. News from the provinces or foreign lands arrived slowly and was often filtered through the lens of courtly interest. This insular environment could lead to a skewed perception of reality, a detachment from the concerns and hardships of the ordinary people of France. Their gilded cage, while offering proximity to power, also isolated them from the wider world. The role of art and music, while providing beauty and entertainment, was also deeply intertwined with the projection of royal power and propaganda. Composers like Lully created magnificent operas and ballets that glorified the king and reinforced his image as a divinely appointed ruler. Painters depicted him in heroic poses, surrounded by allegorical figures. While the artistic quality was often superb, the underlying message was one of unequivocal loyalty and adoration. Artistic expression was, in many ways, another tool of statecraft. The psychological toll of this environment cannot be overstated. The constant anxiety, the fear of failure, the lack of privacy, the physical discomforts, the pressure to conform, it all contributed to a state of chronic stress. While some thrived in this high-stakes game, many others likely suffered from what we might now recognize as anxiety disorders, depression, or burnout. The glittering surface of Versailles concealed a great deal of quiet desperation and mental anguish, a reality rarely captured in the heroic portraits. Think about the sheer sensory overload combined with deprivation. You were bombarded with noise, smells, and the visual cacophony of fashion and display. Yet, you might be deprived of genuine warmth, clean air, nutritious food, or a moment of true peace. This imbalance would have been disorienting and draining. Your body and mind would be constantly adapting, constantly on alert, rarely able to find a point of equilibrium. It's a far cry from the balanced, controlled environments you strive for today. The legal system, as it pertained to the nobility, could be arbitrary and heavily influenced by royal favor. While laws existed, their application could depend on one's status and connection. A well-placed word from a powerful patron could see an offense overlooked, while an enemy at court could ensure the harshest possible penalty. Justice was not always blind. It often peeked from behind the silken gloves of influence and intrigue. This uncertainty added another layer of precariousness to life at Versailles. The concept of meritocracy, as you understand it, was largely absent. Advancement was primarily based on birth, connections, and the ability to navigate the complex social politics of the court. Talent and competence were useful, but often secondary to lineage and favor. This could lead to immense frustration for those with ability, but without the requisite pedigree or social grace. The system was designed to perpetuate the power of a select few, not to reward individual merit in a broader sense. Let's consider the simple act of sleeping in your small, possibly shared, and likely drafty room. True restorative sleep might have been hard to come by. The thin walls, the distant sounds of revelry or servants' activity, the anxieties of the day replaying in your mind, the physical discomforts of a lumpy mattress or insufficient bedding, all could conspire against a peaceful night. You might wake feeling as tired as when you went to bed, facing another day of demanding performances. The lighting within the palace, after dark, was primarily by candlelight or oil lamps. This would have cast flickering shadows, creating an atmosphere far removed from the bright, even illumination you take for granted. Corridors could be dimly lit and treacherous. Reading or writing at night would have strained your eye. The ever-present risk of fire from unattended candles was also a serious concern in a building filled with flammable tapestries, wooden furniture, and elaborate fabrics. The education of a young noble was less about critical thinking and more about acquiring the necessary social graces and accomplishments. Fencing, dancing, horsemanship, a smattering of languages, and perhaps some music. These were the skills valued. Deep, intellectual inquiry, especially if it questioned established norms, was not generally encouraged. The aim was to produce polished courtiers, not independent thinkers, fitting them neatly into the preordained slots of the hierarchical system. The sheer wastefulness of court life was staggering. Food thrown away, elaborate costumes worn only once or twice, vast sums spent on fleeting entertainments. This conspicuous consumption was a display of wealth and power, but it stood in stark contrast to the poverty experienced by much of the French population. For a courtier struggling with debt, witnessing this profligate spending while trying to maintain their own facade must have been a source of bitter irony and perhaps resentment. The medical understanding of mental illness was virtually non-existent. Those suffering from severe depression, anxiety, or other psychological ailments were often misunderstood, dismissed, or even feared. There were no effective treatments, and the prevailing belief might attribute such conditions to spiritual failings or imbalances of bodily humor. Seeking help was difficult, and sufferers often endured their torments in silence and isolation, their inner turmoil hidden behind a carefully constructed courtly mask. Even the famed gardens of Versailles, while stunning in their design and scale, required immense labor to maintain. Armies of gardeners toiled to create and preserve La Note's vision, and for the courtiers strolling through them, these too were a stage. A private conversation might be overheard. A solitary walk might be interpreted as melancholy or plotting. There was little escape from the public gaze, even amidst the carefully sculpted nature. Every space was, in essence, a public space. The system of patronage was all-encompassing. To get anywhere, you needed a powerful patron to champion your cause, to speak for you to the king, to secure you a position or a pension. This meant a constant game of flattery, service, and sometimes sycophants. Your loyalty was expected to be absolute, and falling out with your patron could mean the end of your ambitions. It was a demeaning dance for many, sacrificing personal dignity for the hope of advancement. And what of old age at court? If you survived the diseases, the duels, and the political machinations, old age was not necessarily a time of peaceful retirement. Declining health and faculties could make it difficult to keep up with the demands of court life. Younger, more ambitious courtiers would be eager to take your place. Unless you had secured a powerful position or the king's enduring favor, you might find yourself marginalized, a relic of a bygone era, your influence waning with your physical strength. The obsession with genealogy and lineage was paramount. Your ancestry, your family connections, the purity of your noble blood, these were critical determinants of your status and opportunities. An unfortunate marriage in your family's past, or a hint of non-noble blood, could be a significant impediment. This rigid adherence to her hereditary privilege left little room for social mobility based on individual achievement, reinforcing a closed and often stagnant system. The religious life at court, while outwardly pious, with regular attendance at Mass,
could also be a performer. Louis IV, as the most Christian king, expected a display of devotion from his courtiers. Genuine faith certainly existed, but for many, religious observance was another facet of courtly duty, a way to demonstrate loyalty and conformity. Hypocrisy was likely not uncommon, with private behavior sometimes diverging sharply from public displays of piety. Consider the simple act of communication. Without telephones or email, messages were hand-delivered, a slow and sometimes unreliable process. Important news could take hours or even days to travel within the vast palace complex, or to and from Paris. Rumors could spread faster than facts, often distorted in the telling. This inefficiency and unreliability of communication added to the general sense of uncertainty and could have significant consequences in a world where timely information was power. The air quality, beyond just the odors, was likely poor. Wood and coal fires for heating and cooking, thousands of tallow candles, and the general lack of ventilation in many areas would have filled the air with smoke and particulate matter. Respiratory problems, coughs, and lung ailments were probably common, exacerbated by the crowded conditions and the pervasive dampness and cold in winter. You would be breathing in a cocktail of irritants daily. The sheer effort of maintaining composure in the face of constant discomfort, stress, and scrutiny must have been immense. To always appear elegant, witty, and untroubled, even when you were cold, hungry, anxious, or ill, required an extraordinary degree of self-control. This constant performance, this suppression of genuine feeling, was perhaps one of the heaviest burdens of life at Versailles. It was a world where authenticity was a dangerous luxury. The financial anxieties were not limited to clothing, gambling debts, the cost of maintaining horses and carriages, the need to host lavish entertainments to keep up appearances, bribes or gifts to secure favor. It all added up. Many nobles lived perpetually on the brink of financial ruin, their estates mortgaged, their futures uncertain. This undercurrent of economic precarity was a stark contrast to the outward display of opulence, a constant source of worry, and if you fell from favor, banishment from court was not just a social disgrace, it was often financial and political oblivion. Stripped of your proximity to the king, your influence vanished, your creditors might close in, and your allies might desert you. The fall could be swift and brutal, a stark reminder of the precariousness of a life built on the shifting sands of royal wind. The fear of this fate haunted many a courtier. So as you drift off, perhaps consider the immense gulf between the romanticized image of Versailles and the often harsh, uncomfortable and anxiety-ridden reality for those who lived within its golden confines. The pursuit of glory and favor came at a tremendous personal cost. The glittering surface concealed a world of struggle, a world where your modern comforts and freedoms would have seemed like an impossible utopia. The son of the Sun King cast very long, very dark shadows indeed. Sleep now, and perhaps appreciate the quiet, the warmth, the privacy, and the relative ease of your own existence. The meticulously crafted illusions of the past often hide a truth that is far more mundane and far more humanly difficult than the storybooks would have us believe. The weight of that gilded cage was heavy indeed.
In the late 19th century, the great glass dome of the Harvard College Observatory was a gateway to the cosmos. But it was a gateway for men only. The hallowed sanctum of the Great Refractor Telescope, where men charted the heavens, was strictly off-limits to women. Yet within the observatory's brick walls, in a crowded, dusty room, another kind of astronomical revolution was quietly unfolding. Here, a team of women sat hunched over wooden desks, peering at large glass photographic plates, each one a frozen snapshot of the night sky. They were known, in the casual sexism of the era, as Pickering's harem, named after the observatory's director, Edward Charles Pickering. He had hired them for a task considered too tedious and laborious for the male astronomers, to catalogue the stars. Their job was to measure the position and brightness of every single point of light on thousands of these fragile glass negatives. They were the computers, human machines, performing meticulous, repetitive calculations for a wage of just 20. It was demanding, eye-straining work, but for many women with a passion for science, it was the only door open to the world of astronomy. And into this world walked a quiet, deeply devout woman from Lancaster, Massachusetts, who would change the way we see everything. Her name was Henrietta Swan Leavitt. Leavitt was the daughter of a congregational minister, a graduate of Radcliffe College, which was then the female annex to the all-male Harvard. She was brilliant, but unassuming. A severe illness in her youth had left her profoundly deaf, and this seemed to deepen her natural inclination towards a quiet, interior life of intense focus. She joined Pickering's team in 1893, first as a volunteer, then as a permanent staff member. Her task was specific. She was assigned a box of photographic plates, showing the Magellanic Clouds, two hazy, cloud-like objects visible only from the southern hemisphere. To most, they were cosmic smudges. To Leavitt, they would become the key to the universe. Her work was a painstaking exercise in pattern recognition. Day after day, she would compare plates of the same patch of sky taken on different nights. She would use a tool called a blink comparator, which would flash two images in quick succession, to see if any of the thousands of tiny black dots had changed in size or intensity. She was looking for variable stars, stars that pulsate, growing brighter and then dimmer over a regular period. In the small Magellanic Cloud, she began to notice something extraordinary. She focused on a particular class of variable stars, known as Facade variables. As she meticulously catalogued them, measuring their brightness at their peak and their dimmest, and timing the precise length of their pulsation cycle, a stunning pattern began to emerge from the data. It was a relationship of sublime simplicity and profound consequence. The brighter the star, the longer it took to complete its cycle of pulsation. A Cephade that took 30 days to go from bright to dim and back again was intrinsically more luminous than one that completed its cycle in just 3 days. This was not a random correlation. It was a precise mathematical law. Leavitt had discovered a fundamental property of these stars. The pulsation period was a direct indicator of the star's true, absolute brightness, much like the wattage of a light bulb. She understood the significance of this. In a 1908 publication of the Harvard Observatory's Annals, she noted her discovery with characteristic modesty, a brief, clear-eyed observation in a dense volume of data. She wrote that a straight line can be readily drawn among each of the two series of points. It was one of the most consequential straight lines in the history of science. Why was this so important? Because determining distance in space is the single most difficult problem in astronomy. A star might appear dim in our sky, because it is truly a faint star, or it could be an incredibly bright star that is simply very, very far away. There was no way to tell the difference. This is where Leavitt's discovery became the ultimate cosmic yardstick. Imagine you are in a vast, dark field, and you see a single candle. You have no idea if it's a small birthday candle 10 feet away or a massive bonfire a mile away. But now imagine you know that all candles of a certain type, let's call them Leavitt's candles, have exactly the same intrinsic brightness. They are all 100-watt bulbs. Now if you see one of these special candles and it appears very dim, you know with certainty that it must be very far away. By measuring its apparent dimness, you can calculate its distance precisely. Henrietta Leavitt had found the universe's standard candle. By observing a Cephade variable's period, something easily measured from Earth, an astronomer could now know its true, absolute brightness. By comparing this true brightness to how bright it appeared from Earth, they could calculate its distance. Her period-luminosity relationship, as it came to be known, was the key that would unlock the vastness of space. Leavitt herself, bound by the conventions of her role and her own humble nature, did not take the final dramatic steps her discovery made possible. Her job was to find the pattern and report the data. The grand interpretations were left to the male astronomers, who had access to the more powerful telescopes and the academic platforms. She was a mapmaker, not the celebrated explorer, who would plant a flag on a new continent. The first of these explorers was an ambitious astronomer named Harlow Shapley. In the years following Leavitt's discovery, Shapley used her period-luminosity relationship to measure the distances to globular clusters, dense balls of stars, within our own Milky Way galaxy. His results were staggering. He showed that the Milky Way was vastly larger than anyone had ever imagined, a colossal disk of stars perhaps 100,000 light-years across. He also showed that our own sun was not at its center, but was relegated to an unremarkable position in a distant spiral arm. Leavitt's work had dethroned humanity from the center of its own galaxy, but the most profound revelation was yet to come. In the 1920s, the dominant view was that the Milky Way was the entire universe. The faint, spiral-shaped nebulae seen through telescopes, like the one in the constellation Andromeda, were believed to be small gas clouds or emerging solar systems within our own galaxy. An astronomer named Edwin Hubble, working at the Mount Wilson Observatory in California with the most powerful telescope in the world, decided to settle this great debate. He pointed the 100-inch Hooker telescope at the Andromeda Nebula. Night after night, he took long-exposure photographs. And in those photographs, he found what he was looking for: Cephade variable stars. He meticulously measured their pulsation periods. Then, using Henrietta Leavitt's period-luminosity law, he performed the calculation. The result was world-shattering. The distance he calculated to Andromeda was nearly 1,000,000 light-years. This was an immense distance, placing it far, far outside the most generous estimates for the size of the Milky Way. Andromeda was not a cloud inside our galaxy. It was an entirely separate galaxy, a vast island universe of hundreds of billions of stars, just like our own. The spiral nebulae were not nebulae at all, they were other galaxies. In a single stroke, the known universe expanded by a factor of billions. The Milky Way was just one of countless galaxies scattered through the immensity of space. This was arguably the single greatest shift in cosmic perspective in human history, and it was built directly upon the foundation of Henrietta Leavitt's patient work in her dusty Harvard office. Hubble himself always acknowledged this, stating that Leavitt's discovery was the tool that made his own possible. Yet, Leavitt herself received little recognition in her lifetime. She continued her work at Harvard, quietly and diligently cataloging her star. She never married, never had children, and dedicated her life to her work in her church. She was a respected member of the computer team, but she was never given the status or salary of her male colleagues. She was never promoted to the rank of astronomer. Tragically, just as her work was beginning to reshape the cosmos, her own time was running out. In 1921, Henrietta Swan Leavitt died of stomach cancer. She was only 53, her death was as quiet as her life. The world at large took no note. A few years later in 1925, a letter arrived at the Harvard Observatory from Gösta Mittag-Leffler, a prominent member of the Swedish Academy of Sciences. He wrote to inform Professor Pickering that he wished to nominate Henrietta Leavitt for the Nobel Prize in Physics for her groundbreaking work on Cepheid variables. The new director of the observatory, Harlow Shapley, had to write back with the sad news. He informed Mittag-Leffler that Miss Leavitt had passed away 3 years prior. The Nobel Prize is not awarded posthumously. Her chance for the ultimate scientific honor had been missed. It is a poignant footnote to her story that the men who built upon her work, like Hubble, became household names, while the woman who laid the cornerstone remained in obscurity. Today, Henrietta Leavitt's legacy is finally being recognized. Her period luminosity law remains a fundamental tool in cosmology, the first rung on the cosmic distance ladder that allows us to measure the scale of the universe and the rate of its expansion. She was a true pioneer, a woman who denied the tools and status of her male peers, used her intellect and incredible patience to find a pattern hidden in plain sight. Her story is a powerful reminder that science is not always a tale of heroic eureka moments under a starry sky.
In the heart of Campania, under the warm Italian sun, lay the city of Capua. It was a place of wealth and luxury, famed for its bronze work, its perfumes, and its fine gladiatorial schools. Within the stone walls of one such school, owned by a man named Lentulus Batiarius, lived a human being treated as a thing. He was a Thracian, a man from the wild lands to the northeast of Greece. His name was Spartacus. History tells us little of his life before Capua. He was said to have once served as an auxiliary soldier in the Roman army, a man who knew their methods and their discipline, before being deserted or captured and sold into the ultimate degradation, the arena. He was being trained to kill and to die for the entertainment of others. In the gladiator school, life was brutal and short. Men from Gaul, from Germania, from Thrace, all torn from their homes, were forged into perfect instruments of violence. They were fed, trained, and housed, but they were prisoners, their lives forfeit to the whim of an editor's thumb in the Colosseum. They were living dead men, but in Spartacus, the spark of human dignity had not been extinguished. It smoldered beneath the surface, waiting for a breath of air. In 73 BCE, that moment came. A plan was hatched. A desperate whisper of freedom passed among the gladiators. Their plot was discovered, but it was too late to stop the fires. Seizing whatever they could find, kitchen knives, meat cleavers, cooking spits, Spartacus and some 70 of his fellow gladiators fought their way out of the school. They overwhelmed their guards, killed their master, and fled the city. A small band of fugitives in a land that considered them less than human. They were free, but they were hunted. Their first refuge was the slumbering giant that loomed over the entire region, Mount Vesuvius. On its steep, vine-covered slopes, they established a defensible camp. News of their escape spread like wildfire. To the Romans, it was an annoyance, a minor breakdown in public order, not a threat. The Senate in Rome dispatched a praetor named Gaius Claudius Glyber with a force of 3,000 militia. They were not legionaries, but hastily assembled citizen soldiers, deemed more than sufficient to deal with a handful of runaway slaves. Glyber did not even bother with a direct assault. He simply blockaded the only known path down the mountain, content to wait for hunger and thirst to force the gladiators to surrender. It was a classic, arrogant Roman mistake. He underestimated his enemy. Spartacus was not just a brute fighter, he was a brilliant tactician. He looked at the wild vines clinging to the cliffs of Vesuvius, and saw not just plants, but a means of escape. Under his direction, The gladiators wove long, sturdy ladders from the vine. One night, under the cover of darkness, they descended the sheer rock face on the unguarded side of the mountain. They silently circled around and fell upon the Roman camp from the rear. The attack was a complete surprise. Glaber's militia, caught asleep and unprepared, were routed. The slaves, armed now with captured Roman weapons and armor, had won their first impossible victory. The news of this triumph echoed through the slave-run estates and villas of Campania. Spartacus had shown that Rome was not invincible. From all across the countryside, a flood of humanity began to make its way to Vesuvius. Runaway slaves, dispossessed farmers, impoverished shepherds, all who felt the crushing weight of the Roman Republic on their backs, saw a flicker of hope in this gladiator king. His army swelled, from dozens to hundreds, and then to thousands. He was no longer leading a band of fugitives, he was the leader of a servile war. Rome, now beginning to grasp the scale of the threat, sent 2 more praetors, each with a full legion. Spartacus, aided by his lieutenants, fellow gladiators named Crixus and Oenomus, met them in battle. He used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and his growing army's desperate courage to defeat them both. With each victory, his legend grew, and his numbers swelled further. His force was becoming a nation on the march, a rolling tide of the dispossessed. They were a motley collection of different peoples speaking different languages, united only by their chains and their desire for freedom. Spartacus's true genius lay not just in military strategy, but in his ability to forge this disparate mass into a functioning army. He organized them, trained them in Roman tactics, established a blacksmithing corps to forge weapons, and shared the plunder equally. He was creating a new society in the shadow of the old. By the spring of 72 BCE, his army was said to number over 70,000. His objective now seemed clear: to march north, cross the Alps, and lead his people out of Italy to freedom in their own homelands in Gaul and Thrace. The path was open. Panic began to grip Rome. This was no longer a minor rebellion. It was an existential threat to the Republic. The Senate, finally treating the matter with the gravity it deserved, dispatched both of that year's consuls, each with 2 legions. Here, the first serious cracks in the rebellion appeared. The rebel army had become 2 factions. Spartacus, pragmatic and clear-sighted, wanted to escape Italy, but many of his followers, particularly the Gauls and Germans led by Crixus, were emboldened by their victory. They had tasted vengeance and plunder. They did not want to flee. They wanted to march on Rome itself. Crixus, with some 30,000 followers, split from the main army and headed south. It was a fatal error. He was cornered by one of the consular armies near Mount Garganus, and utterly destroyed. Crixus himself fell in the battle. Spartacus, meanwhile, continued his march north. He met and defeated the other consular army, and then turned to crush the victorious legions, who had just annihilated Crixus. In a remarkable display of generalship, he had defeated both Roman consuls in succession. As a tribute to Crixus, and a bitter reversal of their own fate, he forced 300 Roman prisoners to fight to the death as gladiators. The road to the Alps was clear. He fought his way to the Po Valley, where he defeated yet another Roman army commanded by the governor of Cisalpine Gaul. The gateway to freedom was right in front of him. But then, for reasons historians have debated for 2 millennia, Spartacus made a fateful decision. He turned back. Why? Perhaps his followers, intoxicated with success, refused to leave the riches of Italy behind. Perhaps the logistics of crossing the Alps with an army of over 100,000 men, women and children seemed impossible, or perhaps he now believed he could truly break the power of Rome. Whatever the reason, he turned his army south again. In Rome, the fear was palpable. The Republic was running out of generals to throw at the invincible gladiator. In this moment of crisis, one man stepped forward. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was the wealthiest man in Rome, a figure of immense ambition and utter ruthlessness. He saw the war against Spartacus not as a duty but as an opportunity for glory and political power that had so far eluded him. The Senate, desperate, gave him what he wanted: command of 6 new legions, plus the remnants of the 4 consular legions. He was given extraordinary power to end the rebellion. Crassus knew he was not fighting a conventional army. He was fighting an idea. To defeat it, he first had to restore the shattered discipline and morale of the Roman legions. He did so with an act of terrifying brutality. When one of his cohorts broke and fled in an early skirmish, Crassus revived an ancient and terrible punishment: decimation. He divided the cohort of 500 men into 50 groups of 10. In each group the men drew lots. The one who drew the short straw was then beaten to death by his 9 comrades. With this single horrific act, Crassus sent a message to his own men: fear me more than you fear the enemy. With his legions forged anew in terror, Crassus began to systematically hunt Spartacus. He cornered the rebel army in the toe of Italy, in the region of Bruttium. It was here that Crassus undertook a staggering feat of engineering. He constructed a wall, a ditch and rampart, stretching for over 35 miles from one sea to the other, trapping Spartacus and his entire army on the peninsula. It was a siege on a massive scale. As winter set in, conditions in the rebel camp grew desperate. Famine and disease began to take their toll. Spartacus, in a final gamble, attempted to negotiate with Cilician pirates to transport his army to Sicily, hoping to reignite the slave revolts there. The pirates took his money and sailed away, abandoning him to his fate. The trap was closed, but once again Spartacus proved his resourcefulness. On a dark, snowy night, he and a portion of his army bridged the ditch with earth, wood and the bodies of their own fallen comrades, and cattle. They broke through Crassus's wall, and escaped the trap. It was another brilliant tactical victory, but it was a hollow one. His army was weakened, fragmented, and now relentlessly pursued by a superior force. The end was near. The Roman Senate, losing patience with Crassus, had recalled two of its most successful generals, Pompey the Great from Spain and Lucullus from the east, to help finish the war. For Crassus, this was an intolerable prospect. The glory he so desperately craved was about to be snatched away. He needed to force a final decisive battle before they could arrive. In 71 BCE, near the headwaters of the Scylla River in Lucania, he found his chance. The final battle began. The slaves fought with the ferocity of men with nothing left to lose. Spartacus himself, it is said, was seen at the forefront cutting his way through the Roman ranks, trying to reach Crassus personally. He killed 2 centurions before he was surrounded and cut down. His body was never definitively identified. With the death of their leader, the rebellion collapsed into a slaughter. Thousands were killed on the battlefield. The aftermath was even more terrible. Crassus, determined to make an example that would terrorize every slave in the Republic for generations, took 6,000 prisoners. He had them all crucified, for miles and miles, along the length of the Appian Way, the main road from Capua to Rome. 6,000 crosses lined the road. On each one the body of a rebel hung, a grotesque and public warning that this was the price of seeking freedom. Pompey, arriving with his legions from Spain, mopped up a few thousand fugitives, and cynically claimed credit for ending the war, robbing Crassus of the full triumph he desired. The servile war was over. Rome was sick. The story of Spartacus has echoed through history, as a symbol of the oppressed fighting for their freedom against impossible odds. He was a slave who shook the foundations of the world's greatest power. He built an army from nothing, defeated legion after legion, and for 2 years, held the specter of liberation over the Roman Republic. He failed, as he was always likely to do. The machinery of Roman power was simply too vast, too organized, too ruthless. But in his failure, he left behind a legend that would inspire revolutionaries, writers, and rebels for centuries to come. He remains a testament to the idea that even in the most brutal and dehumanizing of systems, the desire for freedom is an unquenchable fire.
In the early 17th century, the Dutch Republic was a miracle of the modern world. It was a nation forged from water and sheer will, a tiny boggy corner of Europe that had wrested its independence from the mighty Spanish Empire and transformed itself into the world's foremost economic and maritime power. Its ships dominated the oceans. Its merchants controlled global trade and its banks financed kingdoms. Amsterdam was the bustling, prosperous heart of this new world order, a city of canals and counting houses, where fortunes were made and lost with dizzying speed. And in this nation obsessed with commerce, status, and novelty, a passion took root for something of exquisite and seemingly useless beauty: a flower. The tulip was not native to the Netherlands. It was an immigrant, a child of the wild steppes of Central Asia, first cultivated and celebrated in the opulent gardens of the Ottoman sultans in Constantinople. Its name was derived from the Turkish word for turban, which its bloom resembled. It was a European diplomat, Ogier de Gesselin de Busbeck, who first sent some bulbs back to Vienna in the mid-16th century. From there they found their way into the hands of a renowned botanist, Carolus Clusius, at the University of Leyden. The Dutch soil and cool, moist climate proved to be a perfect home. The flower thrived. At first it was a hobby for wealthy connoisseurs and botanists, a beautiful curiosity for manicured gardens. But something strange and wonderful began to happen to the tulips grown in Dutch soil. A mysterious phenomenon then called a breaking would occur.
A solid-colored tulip would suddenly produce offspring with magnificent feathered stripes and flames of contrasting color. A plain red tulip might suddenly bloom with intricate white or yellow streaks, each pattern unique and unrepeatable. Today we know this was the result of a mosaic virus, a disease that infected the bulb and disrupted its color expression. But to the 17th century Dutch, it was a thrilling act of nature's artistry, a beautiful affliction. These broken tulips were rare, unpredictable, and breathtakingly beautiful. And in a society awash with new money, rarity and beauty quickly became the ultimate currency of status. The passion for tulips began to escalate, transforming from a gentleman's hobby into a full-blown obsession, a phenomenon that would become known as tulipomania. It was driven by a perfect storm of factors. The Dutch were flush with cash from their trade monopoly. A growing merchant class eager to display their wealth saw the rarest tulips as living jewels, far more exclusive than mere paintings or furniture. In the nature of the tulip bulb itself, a durable, transportable object that held the promise of future beauty, made it an ideal object for speculation. The market began with the flowers themselves, but soon shifted to the bulbs. Connoisseurs and growers would trade rare varieties, with names as exotic as their patterns: the Viceroy, the Admiral van der Eyck, and the undisputed king of them all, the Semper Augustus, always Augustus. The Semper Augustus, with its blood-red flames on a pure white background, was the holy grail. At the height of the craze there were perhaps only a dozen bulbs in existence. As demand skyrocketed, the prices began to detach from reality. A single bulb of a desirable variety could be traded for a plot of land, a team of horses, or a fine carriage. The story is famously told of a sailor who, mistaking a rare Viceroy bulb for an onion, casually peeled it and ate it with his herring, consuming the equivalent of a year's wages for a skilled craftsman in a single bite. Whether true or apocryphal, the tale illustrates the dizzying value these small earthy spheres had acquired. The real madness began when the trading moved from the physical bulbs to the promise of them. The speculation intensified in the winter months. The bulbs were dormant in the frozen ground, their quality and even their existence unverifiable. This did not stop the trade. In taverns and backrooms across the Netherlands, a new form of commerce emerged, what the Dutch called windhandel, or wind trade. It was in essence the world's first futures market. Men would gather, fortified by beer and gin, to buy and sell paper contracts for bulbs that would be delivered in the spring. A weaver might sell a contract for a Gouda bulb he didn't own, to a baker who didn't have the money to pay for it, both parties gambling on the price movement. Social barriers dissolved in this feverish pursuit of profit. Aristocrats, merchants, farmers, artisans, sailors, and serving maids, everyone was drawn into the game. People sold their homes, their businesses, their family heirlooms, all to raise the capital to speculate on tulip future. It was a national delirium, a belief that this flower, this beautiful fragile thing, was a key to infinite and effortless wealth. The peak of the frenzy was reached in the winter of 16. A single Semper Augustus bulb was reportedly sold for 10,000 guilders, a sum that could purchase a grand house on the finest canal in Amsterdam, complete with a garden and coach house. The Viceroy was famously exchanged for a massive basket of goods that included 4 loads of rye, 4 fat oxen, 8 pigs, 12 sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, 4 barrels of beer, 2 tons of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a complete bed, a suit of clothes, and a silver beaker. The bulb itself had become an abstraction. Its value was tied not to its aesthetic pleasure, but to the certainty that someone else would be willing to pay even more for it tomorrow. And then in the first week of February 1637, it happened in the city of Haarlem, a major center of the tulip trade. At a routine bulb auction, for the first time there were no buyers. A wave of sudden, inexplicable doubt rippled through the room. Perhaps it was a rumor, or a single prominent speculator deciding to cash out. Whatever the trigger, the spell was broken. The collective confidence that had levitated the market to such absurd heights simply evaporated. Panic set in. Everyone rushed to sell at once, but the buyers had vanished. Prices began to plummet, not by percentages but by orders of magnitude. A contract worth 5,000 guilders one week was worth 50 guilders the next. Men who had gone to bed believing they were wealthy woke up to find themselves ruined. The wind trade collapsed into a storm of recriminations and lawsuits. The aftermath was a legal and social night. Thousands of people held contracts obligating them to pay exorbitant prices for bulbs that were now effectively worthless. The sellers, many of whom were also speculators who had bought high, demanded payment. The buyers refused, or were unable to pay. The courts were flooded with cases. But how could a judge enforce a contract for a tulip bulb at the price of a mansion? The Dutch government, after much deliberation, eventually stepped in, declaring that the futures contracts could be voided upon payment of a small percentage of the contract price. This prevented a complete financial meltdown, but it could not undo the personal ruin of countless individuals. The Great Dutch Tulipomania was over. In its wake it left a trail of bankruptcies, broken friendships, and profound social disillusion. For generations, it became a cautionary tale, a sermon in floral form on the dangers of greed and the madness of crowds. The tulip itself became an object of ridicule, a symbol of folly. Yet, the story of tulipomania is more complex than a simple fable of human irrationality. It was a product of its specific time and place. It was the result of a newly rich society, learning to grapple with new financial instruments, like futures and options, without any of the regulations or experience we have today. It demonstrated how quickly asset bubbles can inflate when fueled by easy credit, widespread optimism, and a compelling narrative, in this case, the story of a beautiful exotic flower that held the promise of untold riches. The Dutch did not, as some myths suggest, fall into a deep economic depression. The Republic's economy was diverse and robust enough to absorb the shock, and their love for the tulip itself did not die. After the speculative fever broke, the Netherlands went on to become the world's center for tulip cultivation, a status it retains to this day. The passion was domesticated, shifting from wild speculation to a stable, thriving industry. Today, strolling through the magnificent Keukenhof gardens, or seeing the endless, vibrant fields of tulips stretching to the horizon, it is hard to imagine that this cheerful, unassuming flower once brought a great nation to the brink of madness. But the story of the tulip craze endures as a powerful historical lesson. It reminds us that the line between investment and gambling, between confidence and delusion, can be perilously thin. It shows how the human heart, in its desire for beauty and its thirst for wealth, can sometimes cultivate the most spectacular and the most dangerous of folly.
The Cold War was a conflict fought in the shadows, a global chess match played with spies, satellites, and secrets. But in 1968, one of the most valuable pieces on the board simply vanished. The K-29, a Soviet Golf II-class ballistic missile submarine, was on patrol in the vast, empty expanse of the North Pacific. It carried 3 nuclear missiles, each with a 1-megaton warhead, and a crew of 98 men. Then it went silent. It missed its scheduled radio check-in, and after days of anxious silence, the Soviet Navy launched one of the largest sea searches in its history. Dozens of ships and aircraft scoured thousands of square miles of ocean, but they found nothing. No oil slick, no debris, no trace. The K-29, with its nuclear payload and its trove of secrets, had been swallowed by the sea. The Soviets had lost their submarine, but the Americans knew where it was. Unbeknownst to the world, the United States Navy had a secret weapon, SOS, the sound surveillance system. It was a vast, clandestine network of underwater hydrophones, laid across the ocean floor, designed to listen for the telltale acoustic signatures of Soviet submarines. Sifting through the terabytes of oceanic noise from March 1968, analysts at a secret naval facility isolated a single catastrophic acoustic event, a short, violent noise consistent with a hull collapse under immense pressure. By triangulating the sound from multiple sensors, they were able to pinpoint the submarine's final resting place to a small search area, a few hundred miles northwest of Hawaii. The K-29 lay on the seabed, nearly 3 miles down, in the crushing, eternal darkness of the abyssal plain. For the United States intelligence community, this was an opportunity of unimaginable proportions. The sunken submarine was a potential treasure chest. Inside could be intact nuclear warheads, missile guidance systems, and most valuable of all, the cryptographic machines and codebooks that would unlock the Soviet Navy's secret communications. It was a chance to look directly into the heart of their adversary's most sensitive military technology. The challenge, however, was monumental, bordering on impossible. How do you retrieve a 1750-ton object from a depth of 16,500 feet, deeper than any salvage operation ever attempted, without the Soviets ever knowing you were there? The task was deemed too sensitive and too audacious for the Navy. It was handed to the masters of the impossible, the Central Intelligence Agency. The result was a mission so secret, so complex and so mind-bogglingly expensive, that it sounded like something from a James Bond film. It was codenamed Project Azorian. The first problem was creating a plausible cover story. A massive, technologically advanced ship sitting in the middle of the Pacific for weeks on end would undoubtedly attract Soviet attention. The CIA needed a story that was strange enough to be believable, one that would explain away any unusual activity. They found the perfect partner in eccentricity,
the reclusive billionaire Howard Hughes. Hughes was a legendary figure, an aviator, a movie mogul, and an engineering visionary, who had withdrawn from public life into a paranoid, germophobic seclusion. His reputation for undertaking bizarre, futuristic projects was the perfect cover. The CIA approached him, and he agreed to lend his name and his corporate empire to Endeavor. The official story was born. Howard Hughes, through his Summa Corporation, was embarking on a pioneering deep-sea mining venture to harvest manganese nodules from the ocean floor. The project was so ambitious and financially risky that only a maverick like Hughes would attempt it. It was the perfect disguise. With the cover story in place, the CIA began to build the hardware. The centerpiece was a ship, a vessel unlike any other on Earth. Constructed in secret at a shipyard in Pennsylvania, it was named the Hughes Glomar Explorer. It was over 600 feet long, a giant floating platform of bewildering complexity. In the center of its hull was a massive concealed opening to the sea, a moon pool, which could be covered by a submersible barge. This would allow the entire salvage operation to take place underwater, hidden from spy satellites and prying eyes. The ship's most critical component was the immense claw-like capture vehicle, internally nicknamed Clementine. It was a colossal piece of machinery, a multi-legged grappling device, designed to be lowered through the moon pool on a 3-mile-long steel pipe string. It was built to descend into the abyss, position itself over the fractured hull of the submarine, and gently but firmly grasp it. The entire pipe string, acting like the world's longest and strongest fishing line, would then slowly winch the prize up from the depths. The engineering challenges were staggering. The pipe string had to be strong enough to lift the weight of a locomotive, yet flexible enough to withstand the ocean currents. Every component had to function perfectly under pressures exceeding 7,000 pounds per square inch. There would be no second chances. The project cost in today's money would be well over $3 billion, making it one of the most expensive intelligence operations ever undertaken. By the summer of 1974, after 6 years of secret development, Project Azorian was ready. The Hughes Glomar Explorer sailed from the coast of California and made its way to the target location, known only as Point Stat. The submersible barge was submerged. The moon pool doors opened, and the slow, nerve-wracking process of lowering Clementine and the pipe string began. For days the crew added 60-foot section after 60-foot section of pipe, lowering the massive claw deeper and deeper into the blackness. On board, a team of CIA officers, engineers and roughneck drillers worked around the clock, their faces lit by the glow of control panels and sonar screen. The mood was one of intense, focused tension. They were not alone. As predicted, Soviet naval vessels, including a missile tracking ship, began to shadow the Glomar Explorer, curious about this supposed mining operation. The CIA crew played their part perfectly, communicating over open channels about their mining progress, while a world away, in a secret chamber, the real operation unfolded. Helicopters flew out to the ship, ostensibly to deliver mail and parts for the mining effort. In reality, they were ferrying CIA operatives and technicians. After more than a week of descent, Clementine reached the ocean floor. Guided by cameras and sonar, the operators maneuvered the giant claw into position over the forward section of the submarine had broken into several pieces upon impact, and the target was the most promising section, believed to contain the code room and missile compartment. With painstaking precision, the operators closed the claw's tines around the hull. They had it. The signal was given, and the massive winches aboard the Glomar Explorer began to turn, slowly, carefully, starting the 3-mile journey back to the surface. For days the ascent continued. The crew watched their instruments, their hearts pounding with every creak and groan of the machinery. The weight of their prize was immense, the strain on the equipment unimaginable. They were lifting history from its grave. They passed the halfway point, then the 2/3 mark. Success seemed within their grasp, and then, disaster struck. A sudden, catastrophic failure occurred. Several of the tines on the giant claw, possibly weakened by the immense pressure or a design flaw, snapped. The crew watched in horror on their video monitors as the main prize, the larger portion of the submarine section they had so carefully captured, broke free. It slipped from the claw's grasp, and began its long, silent fall back to the bottom of the ocean. In an instant, the code room, the missile silos, the primary intelligence targets, were lost forever. It was a moment of crushing, heartbreaking failure. The claw was brought to the surface, holding only a smaller 38-foot fragment of the submarine's bow. Inside this fragment, the CIA recovered the bodies of 6 Soviet submariners. They also found 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes, but none of the primary intelligence they had risked so much to obtain. A secret burial at sea was held for the Soviet sailors. In a remarkable act of respect amid the Cold War's bitter enmity, the American crew gathered on the deck of the Glomar Explorer. The ship's captain read a burial service in Russian, and the bodies, encased in a steel vault, were committed back to the deep as the Soviet and American flags flew side by side. The entire ceremony was filmed by the CIA. Project Azorian was a partial success and a massive failure. The stunning engineering feat had worked, proving such a deep-sea recovery was possible, but the ultimate prize had been lost. The mission remained a tightly guarded secret until 1975, when an article in the Los Angeles Times exposed the operation, breaking the story to a stunned world. The revelation of the mission, and the subsequent release of the Burial at Sea film to the Soviets, became a strange and complex chapter in diplomatic history. The story of Project Azorian is more than a tale of spies and technology. It is a testament to the sheer audacity and ambition of the Cold War, a time when superpowers were willing to move heaven and earth, or in this case the ocean floor, to gain an advantage. It represents a collision of brilliant engineering and breathtaking hubris, a secret war fought not with soldiers, but with wrenches, winches and slide rules. It is the story of a ghost ship, the Hughes Glomar Explorer, and the ghost it tried to raise from a watery grave, a secret kept for years at the bottom of the sea.